I worked at Kensington Palace. Princess Diana's spirit still haunts the halls. It may sound impossible, but after everything I experienced, I can promise you it's no exaggeration. What I uncovered inside those grand walls wasn't just about a ghost. It was something much darker. Diana's tragic death wasn't an accident. It was part of a curse that's plagued the royal family for centuries. And once I started digging, I was dragged into something far worse. I never thought it would end like this. I thought it would be a dream job, stepping into the heart of history, working at Kensington Palace, the grandeur, the beauty, the legacy. It was all supposed to be incredible. But that first night, things didn't feel right. As I walked down the long corridors, it wasn't the silence that bothered me. It was the weight of it. There was something wrong about the place, a heaviness that pressed down on me with every step. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the shadows. I had to shake it off. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The palace wasn't just old. It was ancient in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. The walls whispered even when no one was speaking. You could feel it, an oppressive presence lurking just beyond your vision, like the very stones held secrets too dark to be spoken. And then there was the portrait. Diana's portrait. It hung in the hallway, in a place of prominence, surrounded by gold trim and velvet. But it wasn't the beauty of the painting that caught my attention. It was her eyes. Diana's eyes. They weren't just part of the portrait. They watched me. At first, I thought it was just a feeling, a trick of the light, the angle. But as I moved closer to the painting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself I was just tired. It had been a long day, but the sensation only grew stronger. As I stepped away, it almost felt like the eyes followed me. No, they were following me. I turned around again. The eyes didn't just follow me. They pierced through me. Like Diana herself was looking directly into my soul, watching, waiting. I felt the blood drain from my face. I wasn't alone in that hallway. That's when it began. The footsteps. At first, I thought I'd just imagined them, but they were unmistakable. Slow, deliberate. The sound of shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. I turned quickly, expecting to see a colleague, someone from the staff. But no one was there. Not a soul. I checked every room. Empty. I stood still for a moment, trying to shake off the unease, trying to rationalize it. But then, there it was. Again. The footsteps. This time closer, behind me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I glanced at the portrait of Diana again, and that's when I saw it. Her face, the expression frozen in time, seemed to have shifted ever so slightly. Her lips weren't quite smiling anymore. Her eyes, those eyes, had a deeper intensity. It wasn't just the eyes anymore. It was as though she was silently communicating with me, drawing me in. I had to get out of there. I thought maybe I was just exhausted, my mind playing tricks on me, but no matter how many times I tried to tell myself that, the presence in the air was undeniable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by Diana herself. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced down the hallway. Everything was still too still. But then, just as I reached for the door handle, it happened. The temperature dropped. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, and that's when I heard it. The whisper. It was so soft, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But it wasn't my imagination. Leave now. The voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed in my mind. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I froze. For a moment, I stood there, paralyzed as the weight of the palace and the ghost within it pressed down on me. I had just gotten started in my job, and I was already hearing things I'd just barely crossed the threshold of the world Diana inhabited. But that moment, that whisper, made one thing clear. I wasn't supposed to be there. But by then, it was too late. I was already caught in the web. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the palace. It wasn't just Diana's ghost. It was deeper. Something older, something rooted in the walls. It felt like the air itself was thick with secrets. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it became clear. I wasn't imagining things. The palace had a history that no one talked about openly, but you could feel it in every shadow, every gust of wind that passed through the halls. There was something ancient there, something evil. I was getting closer to uncovering it, and I knew the more I learned, the more I would wish I didn't know it all. I started noticing the way the older staff members reacted to certain areas of the palace. The kitchen staff avoided the east wing at all costs. The cleaning crew would always take the long way around the back corridors, never stepping foot near the grand staircase that led up to the royal apartments. Their eyes were always darting nervously when the topic of the palace's history came up. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of cleaning, I overheard a conversation between two of the long-serving staff members. Their voices were low, almost inaudible, as if they didn't want anyone to hear. But I was close enough to catch snippets of what they were saying. They talked about the curse. At first I thought it was just superstition, something passed down through generations, a way to explain the palace's eerie atmosphere. But what I heard next made me stop dead in my tracks. One of them, an older woman who had been working there for decades, spoke of how every woman who had ever lived in Kensington Palace had been touched by this curse. It was as if each new consort, each new royal woman who entered those doors was bound to something dark. A bloodline curse that plagued them with tragedy, suffering, and untimely deaths. The more she spoke, the more I realized that this wasn't just a tale for tourists. This was real. They said Diana was no different. She was brought into the palace, unaware of the terrible force she was stepping into. It wasn't just the pressures of royal life that drove her to despair. It was the curse. The very blood she shared with the family made her part of the ancient pact that had been forged centuries ago. And the older woman, speaking in hushed tones, claimed that Diana was the final piece, the sacrifice needed to complete a ritual that would keep the royal bloodline intact. I couldn't believe it. I stood frozen, not sure if I should confront them or run away. But before I could react, they stopped talking. They knew I had overheard. There was a long, uncomfortable silence before they quickly excused themselves and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't shake the chill in my bones. Diana's death wasn't just a random act of fate. She had been chosen. I had to know more. Over the next few days, I began to do my own digging. I found old, faded documents in the palace archives, locked away in a dusty room no one used anymore. The records were filled with cryptic references to rituals, to bloodlines, to ceremonies that seemed too ancient and too dark to be real. One night, I stumbled upon a faded manuscript that detailed something far more disturbing than I could have imagined. It spoke of a binding, a pact made by the royal family generations ago to preserve their power and keep their bloodline pure. Diana's name was mentioned, not as a victim, but as the last one, the one chosen to fulfill the curse. I wasn't just uncovering the history of the royal family. I was uncovering a web of lies and dark deeds, all designed to ensure that the royal bloodline would never die. But the more I learned, the more terrified I became. What I was reading wasn't just ancient history. It was alive, feeding off the very walls of Kensington Palace. And I wasn't sure I could escape it. The more I dug, the more I realized that Kensington Palace wasn't just a home to the royal family. It was a prison. The walls were saturated with secrets, and I was starting to feel like the longer I stayed there, the more I became a part of its dark history. But even then, I couldn't stop myself. There were things hidden in that place. Things I was meant to stay away from. I knew there had to be answers. Answers that no one was supposed to know. And I couldn't leave without finding them. One evening, after I had finished my shift, I was walking down one of the quieter hallways when I noticed something strange. A door I'd never seen before. It was tucked away in the farthest corner of the palace, almost hidden behind a tapestry. At first, I thought it was just an old storage room, locked away and forgotten, but something about it called to me. It was as though the door itself was waiting for someone to open it, to uncover what had been sealed inside. I hesitated. The air around me grew thick, almost heavy as I reached for the handle. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave well enough alone. But something pulled me forward. I couldn't explain it. All I knew was that if I didn't open it, the answers I was seeking would stay locked forever. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a narrow stairwell leading down into the bowels of the palace. It was dark, so dark I could barely see the steps in front of me. But I couldn't stop now. I had to know what was hidden here, what the palace had kept from me. From everyone. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a low thud that echoed in the silence. The stairs descended deep, further than I'd ever thought the palace's foundations would go. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each step, until it felt like I was walking into the heart of something ancient. When I reached the bottom, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the musty, old scent of a forgotten basement. It was something foul, like rotting wood and decay. The room before me was lit only by a single flickering candle, its dim light casting long shadows on the walls. As I stepped forward, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something unnatural. The room was small, almost cramped. It was filled with dusty old books and strange objects I couldn't even begin to understand. There were symbols carved into the stone walls, symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly glow. I had seen symbols like them before, in the old manuscripts I'd found in the palace archives. They were part of the rituals that had been performed over the centuries. Rituals that the royal family had used to bind themselves to the curse. But that wasn't what caught my attention. No, what made my heart race was the altar in the center of the room. It was small, but it was undeniably real. A stone slab, covered in strange markings and symbols, stained with something dark. I took a step closer, my breath shallow as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a forgotten room. It was a sacrifice room. A place where the royal family had carried out their dark rituals. I ran my fingers along the stone, tracing the ancient symbols etched into the surface. Some of them I recognized from the texts. The same symbols that had appeared in the curse. I could feel the weight of history in that room. The centuries of blood and darkness that had been poured into its very walls. And then, as my eyes scanned the room, I saw it. A book lying open on a pedestal in the corner. Its pages were yellowed with age, but the writing was still sharp, still clear. It was written in an ancient language, but I could make out a few words. Bloodline, sacrifice, chosen one. I pulled the book down, careful not to disturb anything, and started flipping through the pages. The more I read, the more the air around me seemed to thicken. The curse was real. Diana hadn't just been caught in the crossfire of royal drama. She had been a chosen participant in something far darker than I had ever imagined. The curse wasn't just about keeping the royal bloodline intact. It was about control. The rituals had been performed to ensure that the royal family remained untouchable, unchallenged by time or fate. Each woman who entered the palace, each consort was marked by the curse. Diana, the final piece, had been sacrificed, not just to end her life, but to seal the bloodline, to keep the curse going for generations. The book was filled with diagrams, rituals that had been performed, sacrifices that had been made, all in the name of preserving the royal family's legacy. And at the very end, there was a chilling sentence. The bloodline will remain until the chosen one breaks the circle. The chosen one. Diana had been the chosen one, and her death, her tragic public death, had been part of the ritual. The curse hadn't ended with her. It was meant to continue, but as I read on, I realized something even more horrifying. The curse wasn't just about controlling the past. It was about controlling the future. The next royal woman, the next consort, would be marked as well. The cycle would repeat itself over and over unless someone could break the chain. But no one had ever succeeded. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the weight of what I had uncovered hit me. The curse wasn't just something Diana had suffered through. It was something that was still alive. It was still hunting, and I was now part of it. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling as I stood in the room, the flickering candle casting shadows on the walls. My heart raced as I realized that I couldn't leave the palace without completing the ritual, without facing whatever this curse was meant to do next. I wasn't just learning about a piece of history, I was becoming part of it. The more I tried to ignore the truth, the more it clawed at me. I couldn't escape what I had uncovered. The curse wasn't just something in the past. It was alive. It was still feeding. And now, I was part of it. The walls of Kensington Palace seemed to close in on me, the air growing thicker with every step I took. Diana's presence was undeniable, stronger now than ever before. It wasn't a peaceful haunt. It was desperate, angry. And as the days passed, I began to feel it. Something far darker than I could ever have imagined was now trying to pull me into its grasp. I couldn't escape her. I couldn't escape the curse. The whispers started again, but they weren't just fleeting echoes anymore. They were voices, sharp, urgent, insistent. One night, as I walked through the hallway near the royal quarters, I heard it clearly, Diana's voice, her voice, calling my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. I was shaking. This couldn't be happening. Not again. I tried to ignore it. I walked away, telling myself it was just the stress of everything I had uncovered. But it was as if the palace was alive, guiding me deeper into its secrets. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. There was something wrong, something urgent in the way Diana had called out to me. It felt like she was trying to warn me. But about what? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. Every time I stepped into a room, I felt her presence, like she was there in the corner of my vision, just out of sight. The air around me seemed to pulse with energy, thick with the weight of her suffering. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was happening. Why couldn't I get away from her? I walked through the palace, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. I made my way toward the eastern wing, the part of the palace where the staff had always been too afraid to go. There was something about that wing, something that felt darker, more oppressive than the rest of the palace. I reached the door to a small, unused room that I had seen before, but had never dared to enter. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make my heart race. The whispers grew louder now, more frantic, pushing me forward. I stepped inside. The room was cold, colder than any room I had ever been in. It was dimly lit by a single candle, flickering in the corner. I could feel the temperature drop as soon as I entered, like I was crossing a threshold into something that shouldn't be disturbed. And then I saw her. Diana. She was standing in the corner of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. It wasn't like the fleeting glimpses I'd seen of her before. This time, she was solid, real, alive, and the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to help me." I felt my knees go weak as the weight of her words hit me. This wasn't a ghost of the past. This was Diana, trapped, desperate. She was pleading for someone to end it, to end the curse that had bound her, that had claimed her life. She wasn't dead in the way I thought. She was stuck, trapped between worlds, caught in the cycle of the curse that had been designed to keep the royal bloodline intact. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you need me to do?" Her gaze locked onto mine, her eyes wide with desperation. "Break the cycle. Break the curse. You're the only one who can." I wanted to ask how, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't breathe. Her eyes, those eyes, were filled with so much pain, so much suffering. Diana wasn't just asking for help. She was begging me to save her, to free her from the fate that had been forced upon her. But I had no idea how to break something like this. How do you stop a curse that has spanned centuries? I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. The curse wasn't just something Diana had to endure. It was something that had marked her, sealed her fate long before she even set foot in Kensington. And now, it was trying to drag me into it as well. But before I could say anything, Diana's image flickered. Her form wavered like a mirage, her face twisting in agony. And then, in an instant, she was gone. I stood there in the darkness, my mind spinning. It wasn't over. The curse hadn't been broken. Diana was still trapped. And now I knew. I was too. The walls felt closer now. The palace itself pressing in on me like it was feeding off. The fear, the urgency in the air. I had no choice. I had to finish what Diana started. But the cost was going to be more than I was ready to pay. I couldn't leave. I couldn't turn back. The next few days felt like a slow descent into madness. I couldn't stop thinking about Diana, her desperate plea, her haunting eyes. The palace had become my personal nightmare, the walls whispering at all hours, reminding me that I was trapped. I'd never felt so suffocated in my life. No matter where I went, the feeling of being watched never left me. I thought I could walk away from it all, quit my job, pack my bags, and leave the palace behind. But every time I tried, something kept pulling me back. It wasn't just Diana anymore. It was everything. The curse, the spirits that lingered, the oppressive darkness that seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. I began to feel like I was living in a house of horrors, where every door led to something worse, where every hallway whispered my name. The tension in the air was unbearable, like the very palace was alive and pushing me toward an inevitable end. One night, as I walked through the grand halls, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was like I was walking into an ambush. The silence was deafening. But then, just as I reached a particularly dark hallway near the royal chambers, I felt a cold wind blow through the air, sending chills down my spine. The temperature dropped by several degrees, and I knew it was happening again. Diana's presence was growing stronger. I felt it before I saw it. A sudden rush of cold, a presence behind me. My heart raced as I turned around, but no one was there. I stood frozen in place, waiting, listening for any sound that might tell me what was happening. The flickering light of the chandeliers above me did nothing to calm the unease spreading through my veins. The shadows seemed to move, stretching and reaching, as if trying to claim the very space around me. That's when it hit me. The palace wasn't just haunted. It was fighting back. The whispers grew louder, turning into murmurs that filled my mind, clawing at my thoughts, as if the palace itself was alive and fighting me. The walls seemed to close in, like the building was breathing, suffocating me, trapping me in a web I couldn't escape. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and the air grew thick, dense with an unnatural energy. I turned, ready to leave, but the door I had just passed through slammed shut with a force that made me stumble backward. I gasped, my hands shaking as I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, methodical, but there was no one there. The sound of footsteps echoed throughout the hallway, louder and louder, until they were deafening. I tried to move, but my feet wouldn't respond. I felt paralyzed, as if the palace itself had claimed me, keeping me rooted to the spot, unable to escape. I could feel the temperature drop even further, my breath becoming visible in the freezing air. The footsteps continued circling me, getting closer and closer, and then came the whisper, so soft at first I almost didn't catch it. You can't leave. I froze, my entire body going rigid as the voice pierced my mind. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. Just the empty, dark corridor. The oppressive silence returned, and I could feel the presence of the palace closing in around me, pushing me deeper into its grasp. For the first time, I realized just how dangerous the palace was. It wasn't just the curse, it was the very building itself. It had its own will, and it didn't want me to leave. The walls seemed to pulse with life, a dark energy building around me. The deeper I went into the palace, the more I realized that I wasn't just haunted by Diana's spirit. I was being dragged into something far darker, far more dangerous. The curse was one thing, but the palace itself seemed to be another entity altogether, a force that wanted to keep me trapped forever. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't just dealing with the dead. I was dealing with something that had been alive for centuries, something that had seen countless generations come and go, feeding off the fear, the suffering, the darkness that had been buried inside these walls. It wasn't just Diana who had been sacrificed. It was the entire royal family bound to this place by a force that refused to let them go. I could feel the pressure building, the air becoming suffocating. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of the story now, trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape. The longer I stayed, the harder it became to tell where the palace ended and I began. The lines between the living and the dead blurred. The whispers grew louder, becoming clear, sharp. "You belong to us now." The words echoed in my mind, and I knew I wasn't just caught in the curse anymore. The palace itself had claimed me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The curse had been waiting for someone like me, someone who dared to dig too deep, someone who wouldn't leave well enough alone. I tried to push through it, to find a way out. But with every step, the palace pushed back harder, forcing me deeper into its grip. It wasn't just Diana's spirit I was trying to escape. It was the will of the palace itself, and it wasn't going to let me go. With each passing moment, the temperature dropped even further, the air growing heavier, thicker. My breathing grew more labored, and I could feel the walls pressing in on me. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a trap. I knew then that the palace wasn't just a place, it was a prison. And I had been foolish enough to walk straight into it. The deeper I went into the curse's history, the more I realized that there was no easy way out. The palace had already begun to claim me. Each night, I felt the walls pressing closer, the whispers growing more insistent. It wasn't just Diana anymore. It was the palace itself, suffocating me, trying to drag me into its dark embrace. The more I uncovered, the more I felt like I was being pulled into an inescapable vortex, a place where no one, not even Diana, could escape. The curse wasn't just some lingering shadow. It was a force with power, and now I was its latest victim. I couldn't ignore it. The more I learned about the rituals, the history, the royal bloodline bound to this curse, the more I felt the weight of what I had uncovered. There was no going back, but the deeper I sank into this web, the more the palace seemed to feed on my fear, my desperation. It wasn't just the curse that haunted me, it was the very palace itself, alive with a malevolent force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. I knew that Diana's death wasn't just an accident. It was part of a ritual, the bloodline's sacrifice. She had been the final piece in the puzzle, the last one chosen to fulfill the prophecy that had kept the royal family's legacy intact for centuries. And now, I was entangled in the same cycle. The palace wasn't just a home to the royals. It was the vessel for a curse that had claimed more lives than I could count. And now it had claimed me. I spent countless hours poring over the old manuscripts, desperately searching for a way to break the curse, to undo what had been done. But the more I read, the more I realized there was no way out. There were only paths that led deeper into the curse. The ancient rituals, the blood sacrifices, all of it tied together in a tangled web. Each new discovery felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place. And yet the more I understood, the more I realized that there was no escaping it. The curse had claimed me, just like it had claimed Diana, just like it had claimed every royal woman before her. One night, as I was studying one of the old texts, I came across something that made my heart stop. There was a ritual, a final step that could supposedly break the curse, but it came at a cost. The ritual wasn't just a matter of speaking the right words or performing the right actions. It required a sacrifice. The curse could only be broken by the blood of someone who had been marked by the palace. Someone who had uncovered the dark secrets of the royal bloodline. Someone like me. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The price for breaking the curse was my life. I was the one who had uncovered the truth, who had learned too much. And now the palace demanded payment. I had thought that by understanding the curse, by learning about the rituals and the history, I could find a way to break it. But now I understood. There was no way to escape. The curse had already been set in motion, and the only way to stop it from continuing was to give myself as the final sacrifice. I could feel the walls closing in as the realization hit me. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Diana's death had been part of the ritual. She had been the final piece. But now, the curse needed me to complete it. I was the next in line, the next victim to be sacrificed. There was no way to escape it. The palace had already claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others. I had known that something dark was lurking in the depths of the palace, but I had never imagined it would come to this. I stood in the middle of the room, the book still open in front of me, my heart pounding in my chest. I was no longer just a witness to the curse. I was part of it. The walls seemed to press in on me, the air thick with the weight of the decision I now had to make. I could feel the palace watching me, waiting for me to make the choice. The ritual was the only way out, the only way to break the cycle. But it wasn't just about ending the curse. It was about me paying the price for uncovering the truth. If I didn't go through with it, the curse would never end. Diana's suffering would never end. The royal family would continue to be bound to the curse, and the palace would continue to feed on the fear and suffering of those who dared enter. But as I stood there, I felt a strange sense of acceptance. I had always known there was a price for knowing too much, for digging too deep. Now, I was being forced to pay it. And as much as I wanted to run, to escape, to live, I knew there was no escaping the consequences of uncovering the truth. The palace had already claimed me, and the curse would never let me go. I closed the book, the weight of my decision settling heavily on my shoulders. There was no turning back. The curse had claimed its next victim. I stood there, in the heart of Kensington Palace, staring down at the book that held my fate. The room around me felt colder now, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in, urging me toward the inevitable. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the edges of the pages, feeling the weight of the words, the weight of the curse that had been set in motion long before I ever entered the palace. There was no turning back now. I had uncovered the truth, and now I had to pay the price. I had thought I could break the curse. I had thought there was a way to undo the wrongs of the past, but now Standing in that dimly lit room, I realized that the curse had been part of the palace long before Diana's death, long before my own arrival. It wasn't just something that had been placed upon the royal family. It was woven into the very fabric of the palace itself, and anyone who dared uncover its secrets would eventually find themselves trapped in its web. I had uncovered everything: the rituals, the blood sacrifices, the binding that tied the royal family to this curse. This never-ending cycle of tragedy. Diana had been the final piece, but she wasn't the end. She had only been a link in the chain. This real question now was, what would happen to me? Could I escape? Could I break the cycle? Or had I become just another victim of Kensington Palace's curse, just another name lost in its history? The air in the room grew thick, and I could feel the pulse of the palace around me. It wasn't just a place, it was alive. And it was waiting for me to make my choice. Diana's face flashed in my mind, her pale, anguished expression as she stood before me, begging for help, begging for release. Her voice still echoed in my ears. Break the cycle. But how? Could I really go through with it? Could I really give myself up to end the curse, to end the cycle of suffering that had been passed down for centuries? My mind raced as I considered the options. I could walk away, leave Kensington Palace behind, but I knew it wouldn't end there. The curse would follow me, hunting me down like it had hunted down everyone before me. Diana, the royals, the staff, none of them had escaped. How could I? The only way to stop the curse from spreading further, to break the endless chain, was to give myself to it, to perform the ritual that had been set in motion by those who came before me, but the cost was high. The sacrifice was me. The bloodline had claimed its price, and it was my life. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, more urgent. The palace seemed to be calling to me, pulling me closer to the heart of its darkness. I could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the choice I had to make, pressing down on me like a vice. There was no escape. There was no other way out. I glanced at the book one last time. The ritual was clear. It was simple in a way, but the cost was everything. I knew I could never escape the palace. The curse had already claimed me, and I had no choice but to give in, to play my part in the never-ending cycle. There was no more room for hesitation, no more room for doubt. With a steadying breath, I closed the book and turned to the altar at the center of the room. The room was cold, silent, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows against the walls. The palace was watching, waiting as I stepped forward. I wasn't just stepping into the ritual, I was stepping into the heart of the curse itself. And I knew, with every step, that once I began, there would be no turning back. The choice was made. The ritual would begin. And Kensington Palace, the curse, would claim its final victim. I thought I could break the curse. I thought I could free Diana's spirit in the darkness that had plagued the royal family for centuries. But I was wrong. The palace wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding off the fear, the suffering, the secrets of those who entered. I thought Diana's death had been the end, but it was just the beginning. The curse never ended. It just waited. Now, I'm a part of it. I am the final sacrifice, the one who has to keep the cycle going. Kensington Palace will never let me go. It will never let anyone go. The ghosts, the whispers, they are my reality now. Diana's suffering has become my own, and as the walls close in, I know one thing for sure. The curse will never end. It will keep claiming souls, and I'm just the latest victim